It required both sides of the aisle to come together to find a balanced approach to pass a balanced budget, which is what we've done. And I believe that the federal cuts, whether under sequestration, under what was occurred in the prior fiscal year, or what may come, needs to be put in context with the cuts that state and local entities have already incurred. In Nevada and the Department of Education, 70% of our department's budget are federally funded positions. And that's on top of the reductions that were made by our state agencies. So I'm a bit perplexed, Mr. Chairman, that the line of questioning by some members on the other side somehow is pointing the blame at our federal agency heads rather than taking the responsibility as members to do our job, to come up with the policies that we need to arrive at a balanced approach, which is what a lot of state governments have been doing for many years. Now, I respect the professionals that are here today and your viewpoints, and I specifically want to ask Mr. Picari on the FAA. You know, I'm very concerned about air traffic control. We have 40 million visitors that come in and out of our major airports in Las Vegas. So can you elaborate on what the impact of the furloughs were that occurred in 2011 on your employees? We focused a lot on what the new impact would be, but what already occurred?
To the extent that we've had furloughs in the past, they have not been nearly as broad as what is being proposed under sequestration. I mentioned that the vast majority of the 47,000 FAA employees would be subject to furloughs. That's because 70% of our operations account is actually the cost of people. And those people are out there overwhelmingly in the field, not in Washington, out there in the field. It is going to have an across-the-board, unlike anything that's happened in the past, it is going to have an across-the-board impact on operations. What we're trying to do is minimize the impact on the maximum number of people.
So, and again, I respect the position that FAA employees are definitely going to feel the brunt of this under sequestration. What about the average American traveler? What are they going to experience?
If you are traveling by a commercial airline and you're generally going, if you're not going point to point, if you're going through a hub airport, which the bulk of the passengers are, you are likely to experience delays. It will be significant delays at some times. If you are if you're a general aviation user, you will see a number of places where control tower services, controlled airspace, was formerly provided, but will not be, either midnight to 8 or 24 hours, and you will operate in what we believe is a safe but different operating environment.
And I think, again, this is an important aspect because, again, sometimes people talk about federal employees as some, nondescript bureaucrat that's not performing an essential function. We're talking about air traffic safety. Has anyone forgot about 9/11 and the effects of not having, the top-notch safety that we expect as the traveling public? And what will that cause? There's a report that was issued by the Aerospace Industries Association that said the combined reduction in passenger and commercial air traffic resulting for the sequester could lead to anywhere from 10 to 20 billion in reduced 32,000 jobs. I mean, Nevada, we can't afford any more job losses. We're trying to get our economy jump-started and moving in the right direction, and we need to work in that regard. So is this study accurate?
We have not independently verified that study, but that and there are several others out there that have broadly similar conclusions. What we do know is that aviation writ large is one of the driving forces behind the economy. whether it's passenger commercial air traffic, whether it's aircraft production, whether it's the innovation that happens on the electronic side and the avionics side every day. We know it's one of the drivers of the economy. There will clearly be some impacts on the economy, broader impacts from these sequestration cuts.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I just want to close by saying I want to work with anybody that has a good idea for how we can identify targeted, cuts in Federal programs that aren't efficient, that can be improved, but to, single out these across-the-board cuts that we know are not good for our economy, that are not good for public safety, and are ill-conceived. We've just got to move in a different direction.
Thank you. And the gentleman yields back. We'll now go to the gentleman from Gainesville, Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. One of the things that I have – I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'll yield back.
It's you. You should be next.
Okay. It comes when you're new and you're sitting on the row and you get into the entire hearing a lot of times, especially when you're trying to go back and forth. It is amazing to me how many things we've talked about that had absolutely nothing to do with this hearing, in all fairness. I mean, we've talked about sequestration. We've talked about how it's going to talk about other things. I tell you what's interesting to me, if you want to talk about sequestration, is that their open and unimplemented IG recommendations could have saved the taxpayer $67 billion over the last few years. Sequestration is $84 billion, $85 billion. We haven't talked about that. There's savings that could be had. I want to tell you just a quick story to illustrate some questions that I've got. A few years ago, I pastored, if you know my background, if you don't, I pastored a church for 11 years. I felt led to go back to law school. Grace in law was a strange thing in my life. But we looked at it and I said, the only way I can go back at 38 years old is we've got to go full time to get this over with. So my wife and I, we sat down and we said, I'm going to be losing an income because I couldn't work and go to law school at the same time. And so we looked at all of the things from buying sandwich meat, from buying other things, that we were going to take lunches and cut back. I have 3 children. What was not discussed was taking a kid and selling them on eBay. We looked at what we could do. When I look at this right here, and and one of the things, I served in the Georgia legislature as well, which, by the way, we had between federal cuts. Now, we had $5 billion in cuts, my friend. In Georgia, what we've done is we cut our budget, and we lowered taxes, and we've attracted business. So it can be done. The problem I'm having right here is that there seems to be IGs, and we talked about the cuts, and my friend across the aisle have talked about the cuts for the IGs themselves. Well, at this point in time, you're not listening to them anyway. What's the problem? You've got to have a balance here. I go back to the $67 billion that's left on the table that we're not looking at, that we're not talking about. Mr. Picari, the cuts that you were discussing in your pay cuts were through furlough days, correct? Okay. One of the other things, and I believe it was my friend from Missouri across the aisle talked about the rhetoric from both sides in dealing with what were the interaction in Congress. I think there's also just an understanding here that there's a frustration of lack of sort of common sense in planning. And Mr. Miller, you said this earlier. You made I'm going to assume it was your statement here and not assuming it to anything else, but you said that we just thought it wasn't going to happen. That's the problem in government right now, is this Pollyanna approach that it wasn't going to happen. But it was law. It was something that was coming, and now it is here. I think the frustration that most people like myself who had to make plans in going forward was that you're not planning. My question also goes back to the political nature of this. And Mr. Picari, you've done wonderful with your talking points from the Department of Transportation. I remember Secretary LaHood saying the exact same things just the other day. You've done well with that, and I understand that. But my question is, you mentioned New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, because those are the high-profile airports. Just curious, why didn't you mention Atlanta, which is the busiest airport in the world?
Atlanta.
Because it doesn't play as well?
No.
Because you don't get the bang for the buck from New York, Chicago, and San Francisco?
Because I could only rattle off 3 or 4 at a time.
So we leave off the largest in the country?
Not at all. There will be substantial impacts in Atlanta.
The question next, I appreciate that. The next question. In planning furlough days, which a lot of governments in Nevada and a lot of other places have had to do, so you're telling me you cannot plan well enough that you could not stagger your furlough days in such a way that you would have to close a tower
We will be staggering the furlough days. In other words, the employees will have to take one furlough day per pay period.
But you're telling me that you cannot stagger them in such a way and make them effective in such a way that you would, as your comment was in Chicago, closing the North Tower?
That is correct. In some of our major operations centers, and remember, 84% of our operations employees are outside of Washington and our tech center, the impact.
And how long have you had to think about this?
We have been working on this for months.
And I think that's the problem that I'm coming to. When you have the IG's recommendations and you have these that have been left on the table that are currently getting around to, not getting done, you've got money left on the table, but yet in a hearing like this, in a time when there is now real cuts going on, and that is part of the problem, it's now time to squeal and say, here's the problems that we're having. I'll leave with this last story. In Georgia, a few years ago when the cuts started first coming, one of the cuts was we were trying to look at all of our departments, and one of the areas that was hit was our regents, which was our higher education, which were taking a direct hit. There became a saying that we're going to raise tuition 30%, and then one of our presidents actually said, who actually was over something, he said, we're going to have to cut the cooperative extension program. In other words, we're going to cut 4-H. Knowing good and well that 4-H was one of the least things that would have needed to have been cut. Instead, what he did was generate 700 cards to almost every person, from crayons to pencils, from every child across the state, that said, don't cut my 4-H program. What the American people are frustrated here is they don't understand an out-of-balance budget, they don't understand deficit reduction, and they don't understand $67 billion left on the table. That's what I don't understand, and that's what the American people don't understand, and that's the only problem I have. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. We will now go to the gentlelady from New York, Mrs. Maloney.
I thank the Chairman for yielding, and I thank all of the panelists for being here. And I'd like to address my questions to Mr. Porcari, particularly as it pertains to Sandy Aid. I know you referenced that in your opening statements. I first of all want to thank all of my colleagues that voted for the Sandy Aid for New York, New Jersey, and 21 other states that were impacted. Mr. Porcari, the cuts to the Department of Transportation under sequestration would have a devastating impact on Hurricane Sandy relief efforts in New York and New Jersey. And I'd like to ask about two key DOT programs, the Federal Highway Administration Emergency Relief Program and the Federal Transit Administration's Public Transportation Emergency Relief Program. Each faces sharp cuts under sequestration. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And now the Emergency Relief Program, which provides relief funds to repair federal highways and bridges, they face over $100 million in cuts under sequestration. Is that right?
That's right. It's $101 million.
101. And will the Federal Highway Administration's relief program be required to grant less money to State Departments of Transportation than has already been approved for Sandy relief? Will this directly affect Sandy relief?
We have made provisions with the Federal Highway Emergency Relief money that it will not affect Sandy relief.
Wow.
It is, as I mentioned, part of the appropriation actually covered previous natural disasters. What we at least in the case of the Federal Highway Administration, this will not be true in the case of the Federal Transit Administration. We will not be impacting Sandy relief. The Federal Transit cut of approximately $544 million will unfortunately directly impact the rebuilding post-Sandy.
Well, that's a problem. New York, as you know, is a transit city. We're probably the largest transit city in the world in terms of how we move our people. And will that be a $544 million cut to Sandy, or how much will it affect the transportation?
That transit cut of $544 million will all be towards Sandy aid.
Whoa.
And if I may point out, one of the important things that Congress approved in the Sandy aid is mitigation. In other words, rebuilding to a more resilient standard. There have been 2 storm events in the last 18 months that have flooded parts of the transit system, for example. And
5 stations in my district, 5 subway lines. It's huge.
And it is those resiliency efforts that will bear the brunt of that cut.
Wow. Now, is it disproportionate to Sandy than the rest of the country?
This transit cut applies only to Sandy aid.
Only to Sandy aid. Oh, my word. Oh, no. Is there any way we can change that?
If it's the will of Congress, obviously.
Well, why were we able not to sustain the cuts in the emergency relief program, but the cuts went through in the transit program? I'm just curious. How was that decision made?
The Federal Highway Emergency Relief funds were a little over $2 billion, and of that, the cut, as I mentioned, was $101 million, which left a sufficient balance to not only take care of all the highway-related Hurricane Sandy relief that we believe will be required under the program, but to cover some of the existing priorities as well.
And then this other $544 million is only to the transit money for Sandy.
That's correct.
Wow. Who made that decision? Did you cut transit across the country or just transit aid?
That was a specific sequestration cut. We did not have any flexibility in that.
Okay. Thank you for that information. I also wanted to talk about a flight that fell in the great state of New York, killing a number of people, including a very dear friend of mine. It was in February of 2009. The Flight 3407 crashed on approach to Buffalo. It's very tragic. Both pilots, both flight attendants, and 45 passengers were killed. And the National Transportation Safety Board stated as follows, and I quote, "The pilot's performance was likely impaired because of fatigue," end quote. And both of the pilots operating the flight were found to have, quote, "commuted hundreds of miles prior to the flight," end quote. In December of 2011, the Department of Transportation issued a new rule known as the Pilot Fatigue Rule to emphasize the responsibility of pilots and airlines to ensure that pilots are fit to fly when they report for duty. However, the new rule does not restrict the amount of commuting that pilots may undertake on their way to the airport. And I'd like to ask, I guess, who would be the proper person? Mr. Scoville, or who would be the proper person to answer that? Have you recommended that the FAA ensure that the collection and analysis of data regarding domestic and commuting length for all part of 121 flight crews? And why did you make this recommendation? Were you the one who made the recommendation, Mr. Scoville?
We did, Ms. Mellon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Why did you make the recommendation, and what type of study do you feel is required to understand the risk of fatigue associated with pilots' commute?
We made that recommendation in part because of just what you said of NTSB's finding. We found that most significant and eye-opening in terms of when we looked at the FAA's available information on pilot domicile and commuting, it didn't exist. So we thought it would be helpful to the agency in their safety oversight responsibilities to at least begin to collect that data, not to jump to the conclusion that regulation of pilot domicile or commuting practices should be embarked on. But in light of the dearth of the data, NTSB's concern, the fact that the National Academy of Sciences as well did a study and found a lack of available data, we thought it would behoove the safety regulators to take a look.
Well, Mr. Porcari, can I ask you very quickly,
Sure.
Do you think that the amount of review of existing studies and literature is sufficient?
We're not satisfied with the data that we have. Mr. Scoville mentioned the National Academy of Sciences study. There was also some work done by our own FAA Aeromedical Institute on cabin crews that we use as a proxy for flight crews. In neither case did it draw a direct link between commuting time and fitness for duty, which is the responsibility of the aircrew, but we all know that we could benefit from better data on this.
Mr. Scoville, do you believe the FAA's examination of existing literature is enough?
Not yet. The FAA
Why not?
The FAA owes us their response. And I believe it was due, in fact, at the end of last week, the 28th. We haven't yet seen it. I'm told informally that it's on the way. But
okay, I would like to ask the Chairman if we could request that we get a copy of that. That's important to me and the families that lost their loved ones and the airline pilots and everyone else. And Deputy Porcelli, can you commit today to make an effort to collect and analyze primary source data on this issue to determine whether additional steps should be taken to ensure flight safety?
We're looking right now at what can be done in terms of reliable data, and what I can commit to you is that safety is our #1 priority. We know that this is a real frustration of all of us, and we need to understand this better at this point. So I'd like, if I can, for the work that the FAA is completing now to speak for itself as the next step in this process.
Well, thank you. My time has expired, regretfully. I have a lot of other questions, but thank you so much for your time and testimony.
Thank you, Ms. Maloney. And we will do a quick second round. I know the ranking member has a couple of questions he'd like to ask, and I just have one or two I'd like to ask. So we will do that if the panel will indulge us for a moment. Mr. Scoville, I read through your testimony and listened to what you had to say. The bulk of the IG recommendations out of the DOT, rightly so, deal with safety issues and bridges in particular. I know in the district I represent, we have an aging bridge that we're looking at $600 million that we're going to have to replace, and that's not uncommon around the country. In some of your what we didn't really talk about, and what one of the purposes of this hearing was where we can find savings to avoid having to do an additional tax increase to maybe offset some of the things with sequester. In some of the unimplemented reports from your department, did you find some cost savings?
Of course we did. Thank you, Mr. Farenthold. Last year, we had financial recommendations totaling $1.7 billion for the department. The year before that, $1.7 billion for the department. That's not to say that all of those financial recommendations translate immediately to cost savings, because they do not. For some of them, for instance, we would expect that our recommendations, for instance, for the enterprise architecture or FAA facility consolidation and realignment, they are forward-looking. We would expect that they would lead to better decision-making and ultimate cost savings over the course of a long process to fully implement a program.
And Mr. Pecori, let me ask you another. We've heard a lot of testimony about next gen in aviation. I have the privilege of also serving on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Aviation Subcommittee, and we've heard a lot about the delays associated with next gen. I also have the opportunity to speak to various folks within the airline industry within my commutes back and forth to Texas, and I hear time and time again that not only are these delays costing the airlines efficiency and money, but they're potentially costing us money. How much would we have saved do you have any idea how much we would have saved if we would have gotten next gen done anywhere near on time?
We can get you some estimates of the accelerated benefits, but I will tell you just in one piece of it, using required navigation performance in Seattle-Tacoma Airport, where it's in place right now, it's saving the airlines a significant amount of money. It's also the equivalent to taking a couple thousand cars off the road in terms of environmental savings.
And I know they're struggling getting a route from Houston to Corpus Christi that's all been done. There's some sort of other regulatory approval, I think environmental.
The Houston Metroplex Initiative is actually one of the marquee early short-term benefits of NextGen. I've been down to Houston to actually meet with the interdepartmental staff working on it. They take great pride in getting the approvals concurrently, in designing the approaches and the other required parts on an accelerated basis. They're literally committed to shaving years off of what would be a multi-year process.
And is there anything that this committee can do to help expedite that process?
Congress has been very supportive historically of NextGen, which is a multi-year system of systems that, quite frankly, is very expensive. It's that continued year-to-year commitment so that we can plan ahead, so that the contracting community and the airlines can be confident to make those investments, that's the single most important thing, the consistency and predictability of it.
And you know, having had the privilege of touring some FAA facilities, you have some fine men and women working there, but you have 1950s technology in there, and I think the traveling public would be better served, as well as the environment and a vast variety of other factors, if that were taken care of.
Absolutely.
And I'll yield back the remainder of my time and recognize the ranking member for his second round of questions.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you for your testimony. It's been extremely helpful, and it's clear that more needs to be done. These recommendations need to be followed through, and I would hope that both departments would act on them swiftly. Certainly, a lot of the discussion has gone to sequestration, because that's what we're dealing with. And we've heard Mr. Desjardins say there's more to come. He made that very clear. More cuts to come beyond sequestration. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out, you know, as I was listening to you, Ms. Tai, and you, Mr. Scoville, I was saying to myself, you know, the IG offices have tremendous credibility. As a lawyer, I tremendously respect, and as a legislator, I respect what you all do. And I was just saying to myself, I wish that, and as you talked about, I think it was you, that said there was some criminal investigation that you couldn't get into or whatever because of personnel. You know, I wish that there was a level of trust with regard to other Federal employees outside of your agencies, because they, and I was telling a group on the floor the other day when they were talking about Federal employees, it was mentioned that Federal employees only leave at a 0.4% rate, Federal government. In other words, the exit rate is not as extensive as the private sector because they have great benefits and because they have all this pay. And I tried to tell them, if they listen to some Federal employees and ask them why they do what they do, in most instances, it's because they want to help the public, period. It's not about pay. And so, you know, I wish that we could, so when we look at people losing their jobs, and there are going to be some jobs lost, when we look at people taking furloughs, like the lady that I met the other day, who's going to lose $800 a month when she's got 2 kids trying to put one through college, that's pain. And we may act like it's not a big deal, but it is a big deal. The thing that I guess that I'm really concerned about is that I want us to make sure that when we say that there is going to be impact, that it's truly, I mean, it's true. In other words, that if there's something else that could be done to avoid certain things, I want to know that those things are being done. But I guess we get with a situation like you, Mr. Miller, when you talk about a Sophie's Choice, where you've got disadvantaged kids trying to make it, struggling, trying to be all that God meant for them to be, and they can't get there when you're cutting things like WIC and you all kinds of, I know you're not, this is not WIC your piece, but you know, the aid that you, Title I and all that, that's kind of tough. And so I'm trying to, so Mr. Bokhari, now coming back to you, you said that 3/4 of your budget is exempt, basically. Is that right, what you're saying?
That's correct. 74% is exempt.
And so this is my question. When you have the delays in flights, you know, when I look at BWI in Baltimore, they've already got, according to our count, about 258,000 commercial flights a year. I'm trying to figure out what that backup, doesn't that then end? At some point, something's got to give. It seems like they're already flying from 5 in the morning to 1 at night. I mean, so I'm trying to figure out what gives. You follow what I'm saying?
It's an excellent question, Mr. Cummings. This is flight delays. It's like throwing a rock in a pond. It ripples through the entire system. So you may have flights taking off late as part of it. You may have cancellations because most passengers are moving through a hub-and-spoke system. They may miss their connections. Those connections are very tightly tied together in banks. So we can't fully quantify what all the impacts are. We believe that they will be significant. And it's also important to point out that they're cumulative in the sense that your airport experience also includes the TSA delays to get through the security line, then the potential flight delays beyond that.
Ms. Tai, just one question, and perhaps you, Ms. Scoville, exactly where does your responsibility end and theirs begin? For example, you talked about possible criminal investigations or whatever. Where does that, and you talk about this money that's been lost that statute of limitations run, where's the line there? You follow my question?
No, I understand. I mean, generally, the IG makes recommendations. We are not management. We can't make management decisions. We make recommendations, and the Department has to decide how to proceed on those. And it's really, their responsibility to execute. If they come up with corrective action, which we do get a chance to agree on, then it's really up to them to execute that. I mean, that is fully in their responsibility.
But when you had mentioned, the reason why I asked that is when you talked about criminal investigations, I'm just trying to figure out, well, where is that line?
Generally, I mean, when you talk about criminal investigations, that's purely under my bailiwick. That is not something the Department decides one way or another. In fact, I think the Secretary under the IG Act is specifically prohibited from impacting my investigations and what I initiate and what we don't. I do know that resource-wise, I'm going to have to drop numbers over the next couple of years. Let's look past this year. I need to drop my numbers, and so inevitably.
When you say drop your numbers, what do you mean?
In terms of people, because I have too many people. We haven't had good attrition. Well, and that's maybe a nice reflection of they were an okay place to work, but on the other hand, for a budget, it's created some problems. So we have to drop. We're going to have to do a buyout and do all the ways that the government has to reduce numbers. That's going to mean fewer investigators and fewer auditors. And, that's fine if that's the decision we make, that's how we want to spend our money. But that's that's one of the consequences of our, let's put sequestration aside. We're still looking at an era of lower budgets.
Thank you very much. And thank you all very much.
Seeing we have no other members waiting to ask questions, I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the entire committee to thank our panel for being in front of us. I realize we may not be the easiest committee to testify for. As our mission statement says, it's our solemn responsibility to hold the government accountable to the taxpayers, and that's what we try to do. Chairman Ice likes to refer to us sometimes as the watchdogs, so thank you for coming before the dogs. Thank you very much, and we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ha ha.